Hello friends and welcome to my channel. In this video we'll be learning about the anatomy of the muscles of facial expression. To begin with, the facial muscles or the muscles of facial expression are subcutaneous muscles. That is, they are situated beneath the skin. They bring about different facial expressions like that of smiling, frowning and so on. And these muscles are mainly supplied by the facial nerve. Now, according to the functions of these muscles, most of them may be regarded mainly as the regulators of three main openings situated on the face. Now, which are these three main openings? We know there is the palpebral opening, that is palpebral relates to the eyelid, eye is one opening. Second is the oral fissure, that is the fissure or the opening related to the mouth, and then we have the nostrils. So these are the three main openings situated on the face. Now we know each of these openings have a sphincter and also they have dilators. Now as in the case of the eye, we know that if this is the pupil, we have the sphincter pupillae surrounding it and the dilator pupillae surrounding it. Similarly, in the case of these openings of the face, we have a sphincter that is naturally circular in nature and also dilators that are radial in nature. Out of the three fissures of the face, let's look at the sphincters and dilators of the first fissure, that is a palpebral fissure. As a sphincter, we have the orbicularis oculi muscle that you see right here. For the dilators, we have the levator palpebrae superioris muscle and also the frontal part of the occipitofrontalis muscle that you see right here. Next, let's look at the sphincters and dilators of the second fissure, that is the oral fissure. For the sphincter, we have the orbicularis oris muscle that you see right here. And for the dilators, we have all the muscles surrounding the mouth except for the orbicularis oris muscle and the mentalis muscle. Now looking at the sphincters and dilators of the third opening, that is the nostrils, we have the compressor nasi or the compressor naris muscle as the sphincter that you see right here. And for the dilators, we have the dilator nasi or the dilator naris, the depressor septi muscle and also the medial part of the levator labii superioris muscle. Now concising the points that we learnt under the introduction, the facial muscles or the muscles of the facial expression are subcutaneous muscles. They bring about different facial expressions and they are mainly supplied by the facial nerve. Now functionally, these muscles are regarded as the primary regulators of three main openings situated on the face. They are first is the palpebral fissure, then the oral fissure and the nostril. Now each opening has a single sphincter and a variable number of dilators. And the sphincters are usually naturally circular and dilators are radial in arrangement. Concising the sphincters and dilators of each of these three openings in a tabular form, we have the palpebral fissure and its sphincter is the orbicularis oculi muscle. For the dilators, we have the levator palpebrae superioris and the frontalis part of the occipitofrontalis muscle. For the oral fissure, we have orbicularis oris as the sphincter and all the muscles around the mouth except the orbicularis oris and mentalis as its dilator. Looking at nostrils, we have the sphincter for it as the compressor naris and the dilators are the dilator naris, the depressor septi and the medial slip of levator labii superioris aliquot nasi muscle. Now we will be learning about each of the muscles of the facial expression in detail. That is, we'll be looking at its origin, insertion and action. So in order to remember the names of these muscles, let's group them under 6 main headings. The first heading is the muscles around the scalp. Then we'll be looking at the muscles around the auricle. You know what auricle is, that is the muscles surrounding the ear. Then we'll be looking at the muscles surrounding the eyelid or the orbital opening as we had learned earlier. Then we'll be looking at the muscles surrounding the nose or the nostrils. Then we'll be looking at the muscles surrounding the mouth or the oral opening. And finally, we'll be looking at the muscles surrounding the neck region. So these are the 6 main headings, and under this we'll be learning about the muscles relating to each of these parts. So first, looking at the muscles of the scalp, we have the occipitofrontalis muscle. The occipitofrontalis muscle originates from 2 frontal bellies and 2 occipital bellies posteriorly. It inserts into a broad tendon called epicranial aponeurosis or the galea aponeurotica that you see right here. The action of this occipitofrontalis muscle is that it raises the eyebrows and causes horizontal wrinkles in the skin of the forehead. Next, looking at the muscles of the auricle or the muscles surrounding the ear, we have 3 main muscles, that is the auricularis anterior, the auricularis superior and the auricularis posterior. These are vestigial muscles. In this diagram you can see clearly, here is the auricularis anterior, this is the auricularis superior muscle, and here is the auricularis posterior muscle. Next, let's learn about the muscles of the eyelid or the orbital opening. We'll be looking at 3 main muscles. First is the orbicularis oculi, then comes the corrugator supercilii, and finally we'll be looking at the levator palpebrae superioris muscle. Now looking at the orbicularis oculi muscle in detail, we can see that it has 3 parts. First is the orbital part, that is on and around the orbital margin. Then we have the lacrimal part, that is lateral and deep to the lacrimal sac, as you can see right here. Then we have the palpebral part, which is seen in the eyelids right here. Now, in order to get a better understanding of the orbicularis oculi muscle, let's look at it in this diagram. Here you can see that this is the orbital part of the orbicularis oculi muscle. Here is the palpebral part of the orbicularis oculi muscle. Now let's understand the origin, insertion and action of the orbital part of the orbicularis oculi muscle. This structure right here is the medial palpebral ligament. So the origin of the orbital part of the orbicularis oculi muscle is from the lateral part of the medial palpebral ligament right here. This forms concentric rings and this muscle returns to the point of origin. So it originates from here, it forms concentric rings and its insertion is back to the point of origin. Now what is the action? It protects the eye from bright wind and rain, and it causes mainly the forceful closure of the eyelids. Next, we are going to look at the palpebral part of the orbicularis oculi muscle. This originates again from the lateral part of the medial palpebral ligament. It inserts into the lateral palpebral raphe, that is nothing but a ligamentous structure near the eye. Now, the action of this palpebral part of the orbicularis oculi muscle is that it closes the lids gently, as in blinking and sleeping. Next, let's look at the lacrimal part of the orbicularis oculi muscle. It originates from the lacrimal fascia and the posterior lacrimal crest. It passes laterally in front of the tarsal plates of the eyelids and inserts into the lateral palpebral raphe, as we had learnt earlier. Now, the action of this part is that it dilates the lacrimal sac for sucking of lacrimal fluid into the sac. Now, after having learnt about the orbicularis oculi muscle in detail, let's move on to the corrugator supercilii muscle that you see right here. It originates from the medial end of the superciliary arch and it inserts into the skin of the mid-eyebrow. Now, the action of the corrugator supercilii muscle is that it forms vertical lines in the forehead, as in frowning. So, let's concise what we learned till now. We looked at the muscles of the scalp, that is the occipitofrontalis muscle. We learned about the muscles of the auricle, the auricularis anterior, superior and posterior. Under the heading, that is the muscles of the eyelids or the orbital openings, we learned about the orbicularis oculi, corrugator supercilii and the levator palpebrae superioris. We learnt about the muscles of the eyelid or the orbital opening in detail. We learnt about the 3 parts of the orbicularis oculi muscle. First, looking at the orbital part, we learned that it mainly originates from the medial part of the medial palpebral ligament. It inserts as concentric rings that return to the point of origin, and we learned its action, that is, it protects the eye from bright light, wind and rain, and mainly it causes forceful closure of the eyes. The second was the palpebral part. It originates from the lateral part of the medial palpebral ligament. It inserts into the lateral palpebral raphe, and its action is it closes the lids gently, as in blinking and sleeping. Third, we learned about the lacrimal part. It originates from the lacrimal fascia and the posterior lacrimal crest. It passes laterally in front of the tarsal plates of the eyelids to the lateral palpebral raphe, and we learned that its action is it dilates the lacrimal sac for sucking of lacrimal fluid into the sac. Then we learnt about the corrugator supercilii muscle, that it originates from the medial end of the superciliary arch and it inserts into the skin of the mid eyebrow. Its main action is it forms vertical lines in forehead, as in frowning. Next, let's learn about the muscles around the nasal opening or the nose. We'll be looking at four main muscles, that is the procerus that you see right here, the compressor naris, the compressor nasi right here, and two more muscles, that is the dilator naris and the depressor septi. So let's learn about the procerus muscle in detail. In this diagram you can see the procerus muscle. It originates from the nasal bone and upper part of the lateral nasal cartilage right here. It inserts into the skin of the forehead between the eyebrows and on the bridge of the nose right here. Its action is that it causes transverse wrinkles on the face. Looking at the next muscle, we have the compressor naris. It originates from the maxilla bone just lateral to the nose, and it inserts into an aponeurosis across the dorsum of the nose. Its action is that it compresses the nasal aperture right here. Looking at the next muscle, we have the dilator naris right here. It originates from the maxilla over the lateral incisor teeth, and it inserts into the alar cartilage of the nose. Its action is that it dilates the nasal aperture. So the compressor naris compresses the nasal aperture, whereas the dilator naris dilates the nasal aperture. Next, we have the depressor septi muscle that you see right here. It originates from the maxilla over the medial incisor tooth. It inserts into the lower mobile part of the nasal septum. The action of this muscle is that it pulls the nose inferiorly. Concising the muscles around the nasal opening, we learned about procerus. It originates from the nasal bone and upper part of the lateral nasal cartilage. It inserts on the skin of the forehead between the eyebrows and on the bridge of the nose. The action of procerus muscle is that it causes transverse wrinkles. Now the compressor naris originates from the maxilla just lateral to the nose. It inserts on the aponeurosis across the dorsum of the nose, and its action is that the nasal aperture is compressed, as it is a compressor naris. Now talking about the dilator naris, we learn that it originates from the maxilla over the lateral incisor, and it inserts into the alar cartilage of the nose. Its action is that the nasal aperture is dilated. Finally, we have the depressor septi. It originates from the maxilla over the medial incisor, and it inserts into the lower mobile part of the nasal septum, and its action is that the nose is pulled inferiorly, as the word suggests, depressor. Now let's learn about the muscles around the mouth. We are going to learn about 11 main muscles here. The first is the orbicularis oris right here. The second is the buccinator. Then comes the levator anguli oris. We'll be learning about the levator labii superioris, also about the levator labii superioris aliquinaceae muscle, as well as zygomaticus major, minor, the depressor anguli oris muscle, the depressor labii inferioris muscle, and also about the mentalis muscle. So let's look at the orbicularis oris muscle in detail. It has two parts, an intrinsic part, that is also called the labial part, and an extrinsic part, or also called the marginal part. Looking at the intrinsic part of the orbicularis oris, it has a superior incisivus that arises from the maxilla bone and an inferior incisivus that arises from the mandible. Now it inserts into the angle of the mouth. Looking at the extrinsic part of the orbicularis oris muscle, it is made up of two strata. The thickest middle stratum is derived from the buccinator muscle. The superficial stratum is derived from the elevators and depressors of the lips and their angles. It inserts into the lips and the angle of the mouth, as we had seen for the intrinsic part as well. Now, the action of this orbicularis oris as a whole is that it closes the lips and protrudes it. Now, let's concise the name, origin, insertion and action of the muscles that we learned around the lips or the mouth. The first was the orbicularis oris. We learned that it has an intrinsic part and an extrinsic part. The intrinsic part has a superior incisivus and inferior incisivus. The superior incisivus originates from the maxilla. The inferior incisivus originates from the mandible. They insert at the angle of the mouth. Now, the extrinsic part has a thickest middle stratum and a thick superficial stratum. The middle stratum is derived from the buccinator muscle. The superficial stratum is derived from elevators and depressors of the lips and their angles. Now, the insertion is at the lips and the angle of the mouth. Now, the action of orbicularis oris muscle as a whole is that it closes the lips and protrudes the lips, and numerous other extrinsic muscles make it versatile for various types of grimaces. Next, let's learn about the buccinator muscle, that is a muscle of the cheek. It mainly has three fibers, that is the upper fibers, lower fibers and the middle fibers. The upper fibers arises from the maxilla opposite the molar teeth. It inserts into the upper lip. The lower fibers arise from the mandible opposite the molar teeth, and it inserts straight to the lower lip. Talking about the middle fibers, they arise from the pterygomandibular raphe and the middle fibers decussate. Now, what is the action of this buccinator muscle? It helps to flatten the cheek against the gums and teeth, and it also prevents the accumulation of food in the vestibule. The buccinator is called the whistling muscle. Next muscle that we learned was a buccinator, that is a muscle of the cheek. It has upper fibers, lower fibers and middle fibers. The upper fibers originate from the maxilla opposite the molar teeth. It inserts straight to the upper lip. Talking about the lower fibers, it originates from the mandible opposite the molar teeth, and it inserts into the lower lip. Then, looking at the middle fibers, it originates from the pterygomandibular raphe, and these middle fibers decussate. Now, the action of the buccinator as a whole is that it flattens the cheek against the gums and teeth, and it prevents the accumulation of the food in the vestibule, and this is also called the whistling muscle. Next, let's look at the levator labii superioris aliquot nasi muscle right here. It originates from the frontal process of the maxilla bone, and it inserts into the upper lip and alar cartilage of the nose. Its action is that it lifts the upper lip and dilates the nostril. Next, we have the levator labii superioris muscle that you see right here. It originates from the infraorbital margin of the maxilla. Here you can see infraorbital means beneath the eyes. So infraorbital margin of the maxilla bone, and it inserts onto the skin of the upper lateral half of the upper lip. Now, the action of this muscle is that it elevates the upper lip and forms the nasolabial groove. This diagram you can see the levator labii superioris aliquot nasi. Here is the levator labii superioris, and now we are going to look at levator anguli oris muscle right here. It originates from the maxilla just below the infraorbital foramen, and it inserts into the skin of the angle of the mouth. The action of this muscle is that it elevates the angle of the mouth and forms the nasolabial groove. Next, let's look at the zygomaticus minor and zygomaticus major muscles. Looking at the zygomaticus major muscle right here, we can see that it originates from the posterior aspect of the lateral surface of the zygomatic bone. It inserts into the skin at the angle of the mouth right here, and its action is that it pulls the angle upwards and laterally as in smiling. Looking at the zygomaticus minor muscle that you see right here, it originates from the anterior aspect of the lateral surface of the zygomatic bone, and it inserts into the upper lip medial to its angle right here. The action of this muscle is that it elevates the upper lip. Concising what we learned about the zygomaticus major and zygomaticus minor, the zygomaticus major originates from the posterior aspect of the lateral surface of the zygomatic bone and it inserts at the skin at the angle of the mouth. Its major action is that it pulls the angle upwards and laterally as in smiling. Talking about the zygomaticus minor, it originates from the anterior aspect of the lateral surface of the zygomatic bone. It inserts into the upper lip medial to its angle and its action is that it elevates the upper lip. Looking at the depressor anguli oris muscle that you see right here, it originates from the oblique line of the mandible below the first molar, premolar and canine teeth and it inserts at the skin at the angle of the mouth and fuses with the orbicularis oris muscle right here. Its action is that it draws the angle of the mouth downwards and laterally. Next, let's look at the mentalis muscle that you see right here. It originates from the mandible inferior to the incisor teeth right here and it inserts into the skin of the chin. Its action is that it elevates and protrudes the lower lip. Finally, looking at the rhizorius muscle, it originates from the fascia on the masseter muscle and it inserts at the skin at the angle of the mouth. Its action is that it retracts the angle of the mouth. Concising the important points, we learned that the depressor anguli oris originates from the oblique line of the mandible below the first molar, premolar and canine teeth. It inserts at the skin at the angle of the mouth and fuses with the orbicularis oris muscle. Its action is that it draws the angle of the mouth downwards and laterally. Talking about the depressor labii inferioris, it originates from the anterior part of the oblique line of the mandible. It inserts at the lower lip at the midline and fuses with the muscle from the opposite side. Its main action is that it draws the lip downward. Now talking about the mentalis and rhizorius muscle, the mentalis muscle originates from the mandible inferior to the incisor teeth. It inserts at the skin of the chin and its action is that it elevates and protrudes the lower lip as it wrinkles the skin on the chin. Now the rhizorius originates from the fascia on the masseter muscle and it inserts at the skin at the angle of the mouth and its major action is that it retracts the angle of the mouth. Finally, looking at the muscle of the neck involved in facial expression, we have the platysma muscle. It originates from the upper parts of the pectoral and deltoid fascia, as you can see right here, and it inserts as anterior and posterior fibers. Now the anterior fibers insert to the base of the mandible. The posterior fibers insert to the skin of the lower face and the lip, and it is continuous with the rhizorius muscle. Now talking about its action, it releases the pressure of the skin on the subjacent veins and it also depresses the mandible as in horror or fright. Concising what we learned under the muscles of the neck, that is a platysma, it originates from the upper parts of the pectoral and deltoid fascia. The fibers run upwards and medially. Now the insertion is that the anterior fibers insert to the base of the mandible, the posterior fibers to the skin of the lower face and lip and may be continuous with the rhizorius. The action is that it releases pressure of the skin on the subjacent veins and it also depresses the mandible, pulls the angle of the mouth downwards as in the expression of horror or fright. Now let's look at some of the common facial expressions and the muscles that produce them. So looking at smiling and laughing, it is brought about mainly by the zygomaticus major muscle. Looking at sadness, it is brought about by the levator labii superioris and the levator anguli oris muscle. Looking at dislike, it is brought about by the corrugator supercilii and the procerus muscle. Looking at the expression of surprised, it is mainly brought about by the frontalis muscle. Fright is mainly by the platysma muscle and whistling is brought about by the buccinator and the orbicularis oris muscle. Now let's learn about the nerve supply of the face. Looking at the motor nerve supply, the facial nerve is a motor nerve of the face. Its 5 terminal branches, as you can see in this diagram right here, is the temporal branch, the zygomatic branch, the buccal branch, marginal mandibular branch and the cervical branch. Now let's see what muscles are supplied by these different branches. So first, that is the temporal branch right here. It supplies the frontalis muscle, the auricular muscles and also the orbicularis oculi muscle. The second branch, that is the zygomatic branch, It mainly supplies the orbicularis oculi muscle, that is mainly the lower eyelid part. The third branch, that is the buccal branch, it supplies the muscles of the cheek and the upper lip. Then comes the marginal mandibula that mainly supplies the muscles of the lower lip, and finally we have the cervical branch that supplies the platysma muscle. Concising the points under the nerve supply of the face, we learned that the motor nerve supply is mainly by the facial nerve. It has 5 branches, that is the temporal, zygomatic, buccal, marginal mandibular and cervical branch. The temporal branch mainly supplies the frontalis, the auricular muscles and the orbicularis oculi. The buccal branch mainly supplies the muscles of the cheek and the upper lip. The marginal mandibula supplies the muscles of the lower lip, and the cervical branch supplies the platysma muscle. Looking at the sensory nerve supply, it is mainly by the trigeminal nerve. The trigeminal nerve, through its 3 branches, is the chief sensory nerve of the face. That is, it will carry sensory information from the face to the central nervous system. The skin over the angle of the jaw and over the parotid gland is supplied by the great auricular nerve. Finally, let's look at the clinical anatomy associated with the muscles of facial expression. The infranuclear lesion of the facial nerve at the stylomastoid foramen is termed to be Bell's palsy. The trigeminal neuralgia is a condition that will involve one or more of the 3 divisions of the trigeminal nerve, that is, the sensory nerve to the face. It causes attacks of very severe burning and scalding pain along the distribution of the affected nerve. I hope you found this video helpful. To get the notes of anatomy of the muscles of facial expression as well as other notes of anatomy, physiology and other health science subjects, visit my website www.angelinaisaac.com. You can also visit my Instagram page, Angelina Isaac Lectures, the link to which is given in the description below. To get updates on my latest videos, click on the subscribe button. To get notifications, tap on the bell icon. Thank you for watching.